You're live on Newsroom Africa, channel 405. In September, following the brutal murder of Uyinene Mkhityana, women across the country, of course, took to the streets demanding harsher measures be put in place. In a moment, we'll take you then to that emergency plan that was announced by the president. But before we get to it, I want us to continue this conversation and perhaps unpack further the role of gender-based violence and how it affects and influences South African families. In a moment, I'll bring in some of our expert guests that are sitting in studio. But let me begin with you, Lebo.
So I think the point that Tlaleng mentioned about parenting is important. And I often say this. Normally, South Africans look at themselves and they say, personally, I'm not violent. But they don't view some of the things that they do that they are violent. To come to the fact that we are sitting here and there's probably men who are watching us in society who are not present in their children's lives. That 60% of children are in female-headed households. That kind of child neglect is violent. So the man who is watching, who probably has 15 or 5 firstborns, and they are not in the lives of 4 or 14 firstborns because they've had so many of them, and they are not there in the lives of these boys. I mean, we've started a boys mentoring program simply because of the anger and the pain that some of these boys are carrying. It is not justification, because men do not abandon boy children only, they abandon children. But the fact that while we've got a Child Maintenance Act in South Africa, there are men who will just, not because they are unemployed, who will choose that if I fall out with Cathy, I will no longer see Cathy's child or support Cathy. They are in churches, they are in corporate, they are in government, they are everywhere. And if we don't identify that kind of neglect and failure as violence, we will often be thinking that the violent person is somebody who is like that guy in the post office where Uyinene was killed. So I also want to introduce in the debate the other things that we don't recognize as violent that we do, particularly when it comes to parenting. The fact that in South Africa, so many men have chosen to abdicate responsibility in the home is also violent to the women who must now work and support the children and really struggle to make ends meet, leave home, some of them at 4 a.m. in the morning, come back at 8 p.m. when there is so much child sexual violence. So there is a lot of violence that we talk about that is outside what is normally seen. So-and-so slept so-and-so, or so-and-so kicked so-and-so, or so-and-so raped so-and-so. It's just the social norms for me that we have allowed to prevail that we must also examine in this discourse around violence against women.
And of course, often we focus on the women that have been affected by this violence. And I'm going to ask those that are helping us on the floor to pass the microphone to Dr. Shahida Omar. She's with the Teddy Bear Clinic. But the conversation really here is to say, what happens to those children who are growing up in households where there is then a history of gender-based violence? What happens to those? Because we never get to tell the stories of those children. What does living with that trauma then do to them? And how do they begin to become part of society while having to really live with that trauma and not necessarily always being able to get access to the kind of help that they need? So, Dr. Shahida, I'm going to bring you in to the conversation here. You know, you do extensive work in this field. Speak to us then about the impact of gender-based violence on children who are having to watch this continually in the home.
Thank you for that, Cathy. I think it is a critical question because what we see, we've seen this week, in this past week, a child sexually abusing another child, a 17-year-old sexually abusing a young little girl, a young girl murdering her grandmother. And then we question these children about where is this behavior coming from? Now we need to also look, I was asked a question about, are we conflating, collapsing, confusing the issues between domestic violence and child abuse? And I said, actually, where there's domestic violence, there's a high risk and incidence of child abuse, that the two are actually inextricably linked and we cannot separate the two issues. So if we look at children, and we've done a lot of work with young sex offenders, where a lot of the sex offenders have witnessed domestic violence. And I think my learned colleague Lebo alluded to the child emotionally, no connection, no bonding, and where fathers have been sitting in the shebeens and have been, of course, subjecting these children to physical abuse, punitive behaviors. So children learn by what they're subjected to. They observe by, behaviors rooted in learning theory. And I think we need to appreciate and recognize that often children, their needs are unmet, unresolved issues surface, and what do? They, the trauma sits on their foreground. What they've witnessed, they've seen fathers beating, this gendered perspective of patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and they reenact what they've been subjected to because they're not able to resolve the situation. They feel helpless, powerless, defenseless, and because it's sitting on their foreground, when they find themselves in a situation, they resort to these maladaptive behaviors, which is, of course, not the ideal. So I think children are mirroring what they've been subjected to.
I'm going to ask you to just pass the microphone then along to legal expert Lisa Vett. And Lisa, I wonder, is there a way of having a conversation around gender-based violence without sounding like we're finger-pointing at men and constantly saying, you're the bad guy, you're the bad guy?
I think you can have that conversation. It just depends on how moralistic you make it. If you say to somebody, oh, you're such a bad person, you're so evil, oh, I don't want to be next to you, you will never change an attitude because you've tainted that person's identity. You've made that person feel like who they are is poisonous. And they will not listen to anything you have. But I think you can hold people responsible if you have conversations that respect the person but are critical of the behavior. And say that you think the person is valuable, but it's the behavior that needs to change. And I think if we have those kinds of conversations, it may be more helpful. I mean, I think we often talk as if all we need to do is have a conversation, men are going to behave differently. It's not that simple. Shida, others have given you examples. Some of those men are very deeply damaged. A 15-minute conversation, little chit-chat over WhatsApp is not going to change them. They need much more intensive assistance. So I think we also have to be quite careful about the way we speak about men. Because I think it's quite consistent in men's use of violence, not just towards other women, but towards each other, is a deep sense of shame. A lot of their violence comes from a sense of being ashamed of who they are and ashamed of the way they've been brought up and what they are. So when we use language that intensifies that sense of shame, what we could be doing with the very best of intentions is triggering more violence, more of a sense of, I am alienated from society, I have nothing to, the society, there's no place for me, there's no incentive for me to not behave violently, I may as well behave in the way that people say I am, which is a bad person. So I think we have to be quite careful in holding men in particular responsible, but acknowledging that where they may come from may make it quite difficult for them to behave differently, and that we need to do more than just say, you're bad, stop behaving like that. We have to give them guidelines around how you need to behave differently in ways that are respectful. When you are in a situation, when you are angry with your female partner, because all of us get angry with each other all the time, how do you deal with your anger instead of lashing out? So instead of just saying lash out, say, when you are angry, this is what you need to do differently.
It's such an interesting point that you raised. I knew my panelists were going to have plenty to say. Can I, okay, 2 seconds, and I want to go down the line because I know lots of people are going to be burning. And I want especially that you address this issue around how men become part of this conversation and how we have this conversation as far as they're involved.
Yeah. I struggle slightly with what Lisa is saying because, and we must understand this, both men and women grow up in circumstances where they are alienated. Yeah. In fact, many girls grow up where they are told you will amount to nothing or nobody's going to marry you. If really we were going with how people were brought up around violence, we would have seen many women killing men and doing a lot of the violence themselves. The point is there are no sanctions for men who are violent. There are no social consequences for men who are violent. And I think in a society where it is so pervasive, where a man can rape a child and the family can sit around together and say he has come to apologize, therefore it is okay. You know, it is a lot more about what we have allowed to happen in our societies. The example that Tlaleng cited about saying, cross your legs, you know, there are men in the house. Why are you going to be sitting with men who are uncles, who are fathers, who, when they see a child, you know, sitting in a particular manner, their thought is to sexualize them?
Sure. Advocate Brenda?
We can't normalize violence against women and children. And that's where I think this country is. We will continue to normalize poverty. We will continue to normalize inequality. We'll continue to normalize the social standing and class. And because we can explain things away why I behave in a particular way. One thing that we need to be clear of is that violence against women has to end. Very clear. We cannot explain it away. Because we can explain circumstances, all our circumstances, we can explain them. But we cannot tolerate impunity. When you transgress a particular law that we have set a country, that it is wrong for you to rape, there must be consequences. The police must do their work. Once I walk into a police station, report that I have been violently assaulted or sexually assaulted, do your job as the police and investigate and give it over to the NPA for prosecution and conviction. We cannot afford a situation where in this country we want to explain away why violence happens against women. We can't explain why. We can't keep on giving the men the pass when they rape women and say it's because they come from the violent homes. The upbringing is because their fathers were not there. We can't do that.
I wonder then how much work can be done to address a problem if we don't take the time to understand the full nature of that problem.
We understand it, Cathy, but we can't make it as a reason and excuse for the behavior. Let's be clear.
Okay.
It cannot be. We understand it, and that's why we understand the structural drivers of violence in this country. We have diagnosed it correctly. We know. We then know how to respond, right? And that's what we have done.
All right.
Yeah.
Dr.
I mean, Cathy, and this is why, you know, I maintain, and over the years I keep saying the same thing. When the system fails anybody, that in itself is a form of violence, okay? When young children are abused, as they are in South Africa, before they are adults, and they have no social workers in the communities, there is no community health workers who are visiting the homes to do regular assessments. When they get to health facilities, they are waiting for a day, 24, 48 hours, to see a medical practitioner who's trained in medical legal forensics. All of those failures are themselves a form of violence. There is no psychology, there is no post-trauma counseling, and trauma is a lifelong event. Right? And we've normalized the fact that in South Africa, you go through this major violent trauma and there's no mental health assistance for anybody, right? And then when you then grow up as adults, you know, often it is men who say, well, we had a violent history. Women in this country are dying, begging their nice. It's not about seeing the human in the other person. In fact, women see human in men, which is why we still show up to these panels to say the same thing that we've been saying over and over again. And speaking nice is not what's lacking. I think we really need to be serious about mental health in this country. Trauma and post-trauma counseling is a lifelong healing. And in this country, in the universities, you can wait for 6 months for a second appointment with a counselor. Those are some of the failures that are in themselves violence.
Yeah. Sure. All right, we're going to explore some of those issues a bit more, especially the failures then of the criminal justice system and the kind of impact that has when it comes to dealing with the reports then where gender-based violence is concerned. We'll take a short break. We're back in a moment. Do stay with us. This is Newsroom Africa.